A member of the Algonquin Regiment of the Canadian Armed Forces who joined just 9 days after Britain declared war on Germany in 1914. By the end of the war, he was not only the most decorated First Nation soldier in Canadian history, but also the most effective sniper of the whole war. I'm talking about Francis Pegumagabo. This podcast will be focusing on the story of an Aboriginal war hero and equal rights activist, Francis Pegumagabo. He had a fairly sad beginning, with both of his parents passing away before he knew either of them, his father from an unknown illness and his mother during childbirth. He grew up with an adoptive family as a member of the Parry Sound Band in Parry Sound, Ontario. In his early life, he'd worked with the Great Lakes on small freighters. During his time as a sailor, he was given a small leather pouch that was meant to keep him safe from great danger. Francis believed the pouch offered him special protection and helped him perform unimaginably dangerous tasks throughout the war. As soon as the war began, Francis enlisted. Keep in mind that Aboriginals were not heavily recruited early on in the war, and most were actually turned away along with most other minorities. Ignoring the discriminatory bans against immigrants and First Nations, by August 20th, 1914, Francis was judged fit for overseas combat and was sent off to Valcartier, Quebec, to attend the training camp for Canadian soldiers bound for Europe. After a few extremely rough months of training involving crawling through mud, hours and hours of target practice, and constant physical exertion, the Canadian soldiers were bound for Europe. February 1915, the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, Francis included, were learning about trench warfare in Ypres salient, and just 2 months later, he was enduring the Germans' first gas attack on the Western Front. In any war, there are soldiers who follow orders and only do what they are required to. Then there are the ones who take massive personal risks to engage the enemy. Almost immediately after the war started in England, Francis, known as Peggy by his fellow soldiers, was marked as a soldier who was willing to take extreme risks and one who had special skills thanks to his Aboriginal history. His biggest impact was as a sniper, taking the missions into no man's land that no other troop wanted, just waiting for any German to show up so he could take his shot. It almost seemed as if Peggy would seek out danger. Usually working alone, this made his jobs much more dangerous. Sometimes, by some crazy skill, he would find a way into German trenches and stand alongside the enemy soldiers without them knowing he was there, or take souvenirs by cutting pieces of clothing off of German troops as they slept. He believed he lived a charmed and gifted life, which I and many others believe as well. Soldiers from both sides of the war were falling left and right, going down in huge numbers, but Francis stayed healthy throughout 1915 and most of 1916. In August 1915, he was promoted to Lance Corporal. At the time, Aboriginals weren't even technically Canadian citizens. This was a big deal for those who knew him back home. Across seas, however, it was no surprise to the soldiers, due to the fact that everyone was equal, all fighting the same fight, being rated by your peers solely based on your courage and performance under fire and in battle. Lance Corporal Pegumagabo clearly showed his strength in these categories. In 1916, he was recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He carried messages with great bravery and success during the whole of the actions at Ypres, Festubert, and Givenchy. In all his work, he has consistently shown a disregard for danger, and his faithfulness to the duty is highly commendable, as said by the man who recommended him for the award. This was the second highest honor for gallantry in the British Army. Although he didn't actually receive this award, he was part of the first group of 78 soldiers who were awarded the military medal. Fast forward a few months to September 1916. Peggy reverted to private by his own request, and it was later on facing a serious wound to the leg that forced him out of battle until mid-1917. It could very well have been longer, but he pursued an active letter-writing campaign to return to active duty and was back to where he belonged on the front lines by May. He earned his spot back as corporal by November of that same year, fought at Passchendaele, and received another military medal for contact maintenance with units on the flanks and for guiding lost relief units. Things took a turn for the worst. He was stricken down with pneumonia right before Christmas. Being the fierce and strong fighter that he was, he returned to battle in the summer of 1918, where he continued to work his sniping at the Second Battle of Arras. He earned the second bar of his military medal. Pegumagabo was one of the 37 Canadian soldiers by the end of the war to have received the second bar. This achievement was a major turn upwards in our little downward spiral till the end of the war for Francis. 3 years of trench warfare had finally caught up to him, and he began to have disciplinary problems, unlike the ones earlier in the war where he preferred to work alone. By November, he'd been shipped back to England suffering from exhaustion psychosis. Once the Great War had finally come to an end, Peggy returned to Canada. Ideas of home and wondering if it had changed because of the war ran through his head. But what he came home to was exactly the same as how he'd left. He was still in extreme poverty, even though he is to this day one of the greatest Canadian war heroes, and was still not in fact a Canadian citizen, only because of his race. After his years of faithful fighting, it had finally taken its toll in 1952. Francis passed away from a heart attack at the age of 64 after years of suffering from badly damaged lungs. He died as the most decorated Aboriginal soldier in Canadian history, one of the 37 men to have received the second band on his military medal, so I believe we can discard the Aboriginal piece of that and just call him one of the most decorated soldiers in Canadian history. His family still tells stories of his war efforts, his 378 sniper kills, more than anyone else from any other country during the war, and the amount of courage that he had in order to follow through on all of his dangerous assignments. To his family and people, he is not only remembered as a Canadian soldier, but as an icon for all those discriminated against and pushed away from doing something great only because of how they looked. He pushed the limits of race all the way overseas, where he proved to everyone minorities are just as important and skilled. Pega was the start to the Aboriginal rights movement, but he also symbolizes everything wrong with discrimination. By this next quote from Francis's son, Duncan Pega, you wouldn't be able to tell the race of the soldier, only that he was extremely brave, did his part, and got things done. My mother told me he used to go behind enemy lines, rub shoulders with the enemy forces, and never got caught. He was always saying how we have to live in harmony with all living things in this world. Francis Pega left a huge impact on all the Canadian Aboriginals today, getting the rights movement started and showing them that they can do everything anyone else can. I've never heard anything about this war hero. Hearing and reading about his story has really helped me, and I hope you too view history a little differently. Seeing how everyone had a part in the war, how every soldier and troop was treated the same, no matter how discriminated against they were back home. Fighting for your country was one of the most patriotic and honorable things you could do. Francis Pega took that to another level by not only proving that Aboriginals and minorities could do it as well, but do it successfully in some of the best we've ever seen. Francis is one of the most decorated Canadian soldiers, someone who sacrificed themselves for others every chance he could, during the war and out of it, by being the face of the Aboriginal rights movement at the time. A true Canadian war hero, completely forgotten by our generation.